Last week, we took a look at the Harder & Steenbeck Infinity 2024, and in this week's video, part 2, we're going to be checking out the nozzles and the air caps that come with the 2-in-1 Infinity, and I'll be comparing them against each other just to show the differences, and of course, to show the changes made from the previous generation Infinity nozzle. So on the table, here are the two titanium nozzles. On the left is the smaller one, the .25, and on the right is the .44. Each nozzle comes with its own corresponding air cap, and you don't want to mix these up, so it couldn't be any easier to differentiate the two. This .25 setup has 2 notches on the nozzle itself, and it has 2 rings on the air cap and another 2 on the back of the needle. The larger nozzle at .44 has 4 notches on the nozzle, and then the 4 rings on the air cap and the needle. So it's just nice and simple, easy to keep track of everything. An interesting thing that I noticed is that the larger titanium nozzle actually has a different construction over the .25. It's not just the size of the nozzle orifice, which is what I was expecting. The .25 on the left side of the screen has 5 air channels around the outside of the nozzle, while the .44 on the right side of the screen has 3, and they're a little bit larger on this one. Here's another view of this under a normal camera lens. This is the .25. You can see that as I rotate it, you can clearly see those 5 channels along the outside. And here is the larger nozzle, the .44. You can see that as I rotate it, there's only 3 air channels along the outside of this one. And looking at these two underneath the bright lights, you could really see how shiny and reflective that titanium is. Underneath the macro lens, you can clearly see the difference in size of the nozzle openings. And for a different view, here they both are underneath the microscope. It's kind of tough underneath a microscope to get a good shot because these titanium nozzles are just so shiny and reflective. You can see that some of the microscope's light is reflecting right back into the lens. And if we compare the new titanium nozzle to the old brass one, you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. On the left side of the screen is the new .25 titanium nozzle, and on the right is the older .15 Infinity nozzle. They're both beautifully manufactured, but the new titanium one just looks so impressive to me underneath a microscope. Here's a top-down shot of both nozzles, the new titanium one on the left and the previous generation on the right. And even though the new titanium nozzle is just a little bit larger than the previous generation .15, it's really hard to spot a difference here. They look very similar in size. And as I mentioned in last week's video, when it comes to painting detail, I just found that this .25 is a huge improvement over the older version, the .15. The air caps were updated as well. The new one on the right side of the screen tapers to a much sharper point over the previous generation version on the left. And again, like I mentioned last week, that Engineering Explained video by Harder & Steenbeck explains the purpose for this, which I thought was awesome. The old Infinity nozzle on the left side of the screen is smooth along the outside. It doesn't have the air channels that you see in the new one. Instead, the previous generation Infinity has those air channels inside the air cap, and this is the one that I'm holding in my hand right now. You can see that there's 3 notches cut out along the inside. And the new version, the Infinity 2024, you can see that the air cap is perfectly smooth inside. To me, I thought that this was a very interesting change. The head system on this new Infinity is completely redesigned from the previous generation. So from here, let's move along to a few spray tests just so I could show you the difference between the smaller and the larger nozzle setup. I'm testing the larger titanium nozzle here, that's the .44, spraying Schmincke Aero Colors reduced 20% with distilled water at 25 psi. And this larger setup actually makes this Infinity feel like a completely different airbrush. It puts out a much higher volume of paint than the smaller .25 and it sprays it out quickly. I found that it's extremely forgiving for thicker paints and mediums, so it's fantastic for things like base coats or varnishing smaller paintings. But you just need to be very careful with the larger setup because that trigger is so sensitive that it's going to put out paint very quickly if you pull too far back. And like I mentioned last week, the trigger response on this new Infinity is just excellent. It's up there with the best, and it's the same with the larger nozzle, the .44. With the line test that I'm spraying here, this larger nozzle has perfect atomizations, absolutely flawless, with sharp lines up close and some softer gradients as I move back. With the nozzle wide open, I get a surprisingly large spray pattern. It's around 1.5 inches to 1.75 inches. I can actually see this being very useful for me personally for spraying in some of those soft backgrounds in larger paintings using thicker paints. So you just get a lot of range and options with this 2-in-1 Infinity, that smaller nozzle for all the detail work, and then that larger one for the bigger stuff, using thicker paint and a higher volume. You could still paint plenty of detail with the larger .44, but if you want to paint detail, the smaller .25 is what makes this airbrush so special. That's the setup that I'm going to be running 99% of the time on this new Infinity because it's just a phenomenal detail airbrush. That's really what I bought it for. That's what I'm spraying right here for this line test. You can see it's razor sharp lines when I'm up close and not pulling too far back on the trigger. And then if I back up a little bit, apply some more paint, I can get those softer lines. And being able to spray that detail at a bit of a distance where I'm not right off the surface is a very nice thing with this smaller nozzle setup. And with the nozzle wide open, you still get some decent coverage here as long as you're holding the airbrush a little bit farther back from the surface. I'm able to get a spray pattern roughly around 1 inch to 1.25 inches. But again, this airbrush with the smaller nozzle setup really shines when you're trying to spray very intricate work. I covered all of this in last week's video, so if you haven't seen that one, make sure you check it out. I'll have a link for it on the upper right hand side of the screen. And so that's going to be it for this one. That's my initial thoughts on this new Infinity and a comparison between the nozzles. I am very happy with this purchase. I think Harder & Steenbeck did an amazing job updating this one, and I really look forward to putting in the hundreds and hundreds of hours that I plan on using this one over the next year. So if you are planning on purchasing the new Infinity or the 2-in-1 model, I hope that these two videos were helpful. Thank you so much for watching. I wish you all the best in your own paintings, and I'll see you back here next week.